second part of this lecture will be a discussion of joints. And first of all, we need to separate all joints into three types that are shown in this slide. The first of these is called the fibrous joint. This joint joins two bones together with something known as fibrous tissue. That is in distinction from a cartilaginous joint, in which the bones are united by either hyaline or fibrocartilage. And then lastly, the synovial joint, in which the joints are united together, and within the joint is synovial fluid. So on the left, the example here is the suture of the skull. We have two bones joined together, and the joining is a fibrous connective tissue joint. The second in the middle, which is the vertebral column, shows the bones united together by either hyaline or, in this case, fibrocartilage. And then the third, which is the synovial joint, the actual union of the humerus to the shoulder, is a joint that contains synovial fluid and therefore is a synovial joint. Now, fibrous joints can actually be separated into two types, and they're shown here. On the left is something called a suture. A suture is a fibrous joint which is completely immovable. Once the sutures close on a young child and that fibrous tissue forms, then this is no longer movable. Obviously, with enough force it can be separated, but there is no motion or movement in the skull. On the right here is something called a syndesmosis, and a syndesmosis is a membrane between two bones that travel parallel, and that's the most common place where you see a syndesmosis. And the difference is that these bones can actually move a little bit. The bones are generally farther apart, and there is some movement. As you know, when you turn your hand over from facing the ground to facing the ceiling, the two bones in your forearm, the radius and the ulna, pivot around each other, move a little bit around each other. They're also farther apart from each other than the skull bones. And so this is an example of a syndesmosis. Now, cartilaginous joints also, there are two types of cartilaginous joints that are shown in this picture. Remember, the difference between a fibrous joint and a cartilaginous joint is a cartilaginous joint is joined together by cartilage as opposed to joined together by fibrous tissue. And the distinction between these types is also based on the amount of movement that occurs between the bones. And on the left here, you have what's called a synchondrosis. And a synchondrosis is like the previous example between the radius and the ulna, where there is some small amount of movement that's allowed. In this case, it's the costal cartilages of the ribs that is an example of a synchondrosis. The ribs can move up and down, and they can move modestly in and out, that allow for us to breathe, and so this joint is slightly movable. Contrary to that, on the right here we have what's called a symphysis, and a symphysis is a cartilaginous joint that doesn't move. There's the symphysis pubis, which is the one on the front here, and then the symphysis between the vertebrae. Both of these are cartilaginous areas, and both of these allow for no movement. The third joint, as I said, was the synovial joint, and this is a very nice diagram of a synovial joint. At the top and bottom, you see the bones coming together. On the end of each bone is the articular cartilage, and then there's an articular capsule on the outside that encloses the synovial membrane. The synovial membrane produces the fluid that's within the joint, and it's called the synovial fluid. Now, this synovial fluid, in addition to being a lubricant, also supplies oxygen and nutrition for the cells within the capsule. Now we're going to take a few minutes to look at this slide, because this slide shows all the different kinds of joints that can occur and the examples of each. And this is all in the arm. You can also find these in the leg. So if you start at the top left, you have the head of the humerus where it joins the scapula. You have what's known as a ball and socket joint. The ball and socket joint, the head of the humerus represents the ball, and the socket is the scapular area. In the lower extremity, the femur is the ball, and the pocket in the hip bone is the socket for the ball and socket joint in the hip. And you can see how these can get dislocated. Moving down one step on the left, you see the hinge joint. And the hinge joint is exactly what you would think it is. It's like a hinge on a door, which is what is shown there. On the upper extremity, the hinge joint is between the humerus and the ulna. The elbow, remember, the elbow that we can feel, the bony part of the elbow is the ulna, not the radius. And it pivots around the humerus in a hinge fashion. The lower extremity, the same joint, the hinge joint, is the knee. In this case, it's the tibia pivoting around the distal end of the femur. Moving down yet again, you see that the thumb, the metacarpal bone junction, let me say that again, carpal metacarpal bone junction of the thumb is what's known as the saddle joint. And it's just basically, you can see it's based on the shape, what appears like a horse's saddle. And the carpal bone actually acts like where your bottom would be, and the metacarpal bone is the actual saddle. Then moving over on the right side, you have a pivot, which is essentially a turning between the radius and the ulna, and the same thing occurs in the lower extremity between the fibula and the tibia. And this pivoting allows you to rotate your forearm. The bones of the wrist, the carpal bones, glide over top of each other, and that's the gliding joint. And this is similar to the tarsal bones in your ankle gliding over each other. And then lastly, down on the right side, in the lower right corner, you have what's called a condyloid joint. And the condyloid joint represents the union between the metacarpal bone and the first phalanx, or the metatarsal bone in the first phalanx in your foot. So for a quiz or test, you would want to know these various different types of joints. There are 6 of them in this diagram, and examples of each one. Now, in addition to studying joints, because we have to talk about movement and position from time to time, it's important to understand, I will use terms in class and on written materials that you need to know and understand what they mean. And first of all, you need to know what the anatomical position is. And this diagram of this fella is in the anatomical position. An anatomical position is a person standing upright, facing forward with their feet forward, their lower extremities hanging down to their sides, their palms facing out with the thumbs on the outside. And so in that position, if I say that the thumb is lateral to the pinky finger, you know that that means the thumb is farther out from the midline than the pinky finger is. And it's from this position that when we talk about various motions, we're talking about what we're doing. You have to know this because you have to be able to start from the same position every time when we talk about various motions. Now, when we talk about types of movements, and this diagram does not in any way exhaust all the different types, but essentially the important ones are, first of all, the difference between flexing and extending a joint. When you flex a joint, in the anatomical position, you're generally moving the limb toward the center of the person. So for example, here this person is flexing their arm. They're moving their forearm around the elbow toward the midline or toward the center of the position of the person in the anatomical position. Extension, on the other hand, is the opposite. When a person flexes their leg, they move their foot up in such a way as to move it toward their rear end, and that again is moving it toward the center of the person. When they flex their hip, they're moving their entire leg up toward the middle of the person, and we can talk about this in class if you're having a hard time understanding that. You move over to the next diagram to the right of the flexion and extension. You can see that anytime you move toward the midline, it's called medial. Anytime you move away from the midline, it's called lateral. So this is medial lateral rotation. Now, if you put yourself in the anatomical position and you rotate your arm medially, that's shown here on the far right, and it's called pronation. Conversely, when you move your arm the other direction, that's called supination. But you can also call that lateral rotation and medial rotation, as long as you remember that you're in the anatomical position. Moving down in the lower right hand side, if you move your extremities away from the middle, it's abduction. If you move them toward the middle, it's adduction. Similarly with the legs, if you move your legs away from the middle, it's abduction. And if you move them toward the middle, it's adduction. And many of the muscles that do these sorts of movements, their names are related to that position. If you lay on the ground facing up, so that the part that's on the ground is your back, that's called supine. If you lay on your ground facing down, then with your face in the dirt, as it were, and the front part of your body on the ground, then that's called prone. So the prone position and the supine position. From this diagram of prone and supine, you can talk about moving let's say if you're in the supine position, if you lift your head up so that it's moving towards your chest, and you're moving toward the midline, that's called flexing your neck. If on the other hand you're on the prone position and you lift your head up, that's called extension of the neck. If you in the supine position, if you lift your legs up, then that's flexing your hips. That's the whole leg, not part of it. On the other hand, if you move them down, that's called extension of the hips. And so there are other terms of motion, and you can look these up online with Google if you want to. But this will help. I'm not going to quiz you specifically on these terms, but I will use them in class, so it's helpful if you understand these terms so that you know what I'm talking about when I use them.